Just hear those sleigh bells jingling, ring, ting, tingling too. Come on, it's lovely weather for a sleigh ride together with you. Oh, hello there. Welcome to my office for Tales from History. And today we're going to talk about a wonderful winter tradition, and that is sleigh rides. Giddy up, giddy up, giddy up, let's go. So we all might know that Santa rides around in a sleigh, though he doesn't actually ride it on the ground. But what you don't often think about is that your great-grandparents probably rode around in the sleigh in the winter as well. And that's because here in a town like South Bend, once the snow fell, a buggy or a carriage, or sometimes even walking, wasn't really very practical. And the thing that was the easiest to ride around in town would be something like a sleigh. So what is a sleigh? Actually, sleighs or sleds or sledges have been around ever since people have been around, and you can see in ancient Egyptian art them using a sled to pull things across the sand of the desert. And it comes from an old Dutch word that means to slide. So a sleigh or a sled is anything that you would use to slide across difficult terrain like sand or mud or even just difficult ground or, in this instance, snow. In an urban area, on the roads, when your buggies weren't so usable because of the snow, before we started plowing the streets, you'd use your sleigh to get around. And riding in sleighs in the wintertime was a beloved tradition on par with sledding or building snowmen or things like Christmas carols. Though in our local papers, you don't actually hear a lot about it other than accidents. But if you didn't own your own sleigh, you might go to a local hostler and rent one and go out with your best girl in their finest cutter. And a cutter is actually a one or two person sleigh, but you see them referred to a lot as someone who's riding in his cutter with a lady and out in the snow. So sleighs started falling out of use with the invention of modern transportation like automobiles and electric streetcars, because you had to plow the roads, and once the roads were cleared, you couldn't use your sleigh anymore. And that actually was the downfall of the first electric streetcar in South Bend in the 1800s. Was it only operated during the summer and then went out of use in the winter because people didn't want to not use their sleighs, and you had to plow the street in order to use that streetcar, so they quit using the streetcar because people love their sleighs so much. So once you have a sleigh, what do you do in it? In some areas, you would go visit your friends. And in South Bend, you hear a lot in the newspapers about people gathering up your friends and going to visit someone else. For example, in 1901, on February 2nd, the Mrs. Hazel Cole, Abby Carter, and Lena Kowalska entertained 35 friends at a sleigh ride party Thursday evening. And they all drove to the home of Miss Grace Stein in Mishawaka and completely surprised the young lady. The evening was spent in a variety of social diversions with choice refreshments, and the party returned to the city at a late hour. Now, if I were Miss Grace Stein in Mishawaka and 35 of my best friends showed up unannounced, I don't know that I would have refreshments for all 35 of them, but maybe she's a little bit more of a gracious lady than I am. But you read a lot of these in the social engagements of the newspapers, where people have sleighing parties where they use their family's sleigh or they rent a sleigh and gather up their friends and go visit somewhere else unannounced. I have to imagine that when you're looking for something to do in the wintertime, that was an easy thing to go calling and have this unannounced visit on your friends. Another thing that you could do is pick up ladies. And that was a popular thing referred to in many songs, which we'll talk about in a minute, is to get a sleigh and take out your best gal. But what would often happen is that you might get in an accident because riding in a buggy or a carriage, or especially a sleigh, was sometimes very dangerous. And in 1901, on February 7th, so clearly a snowy year, Grant Henderson rented a sleigh from the Eberhardt and Ernsberger livery and imbibed too freely of some liquid, I think we can guess, which culminated in an accident at about midnight. And his sleigh was tipped, he fell out, he was injured, the horse was not, but the sleigh was pretty badly damaged. And you also read a lot of those where either people had a little too much to drink, or the horse was frightened and was a runaway horse and there was maybe an accident, or in a lot of instances there was a large snowbank, and sometimes those sleighs, when they hit those large volumes of snow, would tip over. And often the people weren't injured, but it was an accident. And I was also reading about apparently a particularly dangerous area on Michigan Street where a lot of snow tended to drift, where they said people were tipping their sleighs, every day, every other day. They said there had been 40 or 50 accidents already that year, and were urging the city street department to clear that a little more often. So something to watch out for when you're on your sleigh with your best gal. So while you're out riding in your sleigh, you might get pretty cold, and they usually had some sort of blanket which they called a robe. So you'll see a lot of references to the robes in the sleigh and being wrapped up. You also might sing a song, and there's one song in particular that we're all pretty familiar with that was written specifically to be sung while you're riding in a sleigh. And we consider it a Christmas carol, though it doesn't actually reference the holiday at all, and was written actually for Thanksgiving, and that's Jingle Bells. And Jingle Bells was written by James Pierpont, and the title Jingle Bells, we often refer to sleigh bells as jingle bells as that type, but it's actually telling the bells to jingle. So while you're riding in your sleigh, you're singing this song, you're saying bells jingle, and gives you something to do while you're riding around. And became very popular. So it talks about a lot of things. Most of us don't know most of those verses of Jingle Bells. We know the dashing through the snow and one horse open sleigh. And the next verse is actually about picking up a lady named Miss Fanny Bright, I believe, and hitting a snowbank and getting flipped over with his best gal. And the third verse is actually about how to ride around in your sleigh and pick up ladies. So again, a popular song that you would sing. It's no coincidence that it's to the beat of a horse's trot. So you'll want to sing that, while you're going along. You've already got the beat from the horse, and you have those bells because sleighs are so quiet. When you're riding in a carriage along the street, the horse's hooves might make noise, the wheels might make noise, but in the wintertime, when everything's covered in snow, your horse has special horseshoes to help him or her keep traction on the road. But the sleigh is very quiet, and in order to hear the sleigh coming, you'll want to have those bells so that people know that you're there, so you don't run into anybody else either who doesn't know that you're there. So that's the purpose of sleigh bells. The other song that we all know that is about sleighing in particular is Sleigh Ride by Leroy Anderson, though that wasn't written until 1948, which is largely after most people stopped using those in the wintertime, except in maybe rural areas. And Leroy Anderson wrote just an instrumental version, and then somebody else added the words a little bit later, but it still kind of evokes a lot of that. You're riding in the sleigh, you're huddled up together, you're enjoying the scenery, you're visiting your friend, and that nostalgic winter feeling. Here in South Bend, one of the most popular, as I understand, though it's hard to find documentation on this, sleigh ride traditions was actually sleigh racing. And you see that a lot in urban centers. Once the snow falls, there would be a specific area where people would race sleighs. And here in South Bend, that was actually on Colfax Street, between about LaPorte and Lafayette Street-ish. There was maybe a 10-block area where people would line up all along the streets and watch people race those cutters up and down the road in the wintertime. And you'll hear people later on refer to this beloved tradition. One woman talks about meeting her husband that way when he was riding on one of those sleighs in the races, or how many people just packed all along those streets. Even one of the Oliver's employees, his name is Julius DeMille, he was the horse trainer who worked at the Oliver farm. He moved here from Belgium, and in 1913, he said that his first memory of moving to South Bend was being a jockey in those races, because he had experience with harness racing. And so he said that some of the races were actually put on by the Olivers and the Studebakers, and one of his beloved memories was riding up and down the street in these races. So if you can imagine that happening here in town. So the next time you sing Jingle Bells or Sleigh Ride, or you hear them on the radio, you can think about what that actually meant here in South Bend, and maybe imagine people racing up and down the street here on Colfax Street. So thank you for joining me for Tales for History in this wintry season, and hope everyone has a happy holiday season.